This is Kim Hammer with your devotion taken from the book of Judges chapter 6, and we're going to look specifically at verse 17. Verse 17 reads this way: Gideon replied, "If now I found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me." Prior to this verse, Gideon had to acknowledge that he was weak. He admitted even that he was from the weakest tribe and that he was the weakest member of the tribe. And you know, there's something to be said for an individual that's willing to acknowledge that they're weak. Not so that they can draw attention to themselves for their weakness, but he was actually making the statement as a statement of fact, understanding that the task that God had given him to go out and to meet the Midianites and to defeat them was greater than he was able to achieve in his fleshly strength. And not only was he acknowledging that physically he was weak, but he was also acknowledging that spiritually he was questioning his ability to deliver on what God had given him in the way of a challenge. But you know, when you look at what the Bible says about weakness and about strength, we can understand that Gideon was not on a self-pity trip, but in reality, he was acknowledging his dependency upon God, that if God was going to give him this kind of challenge, that he did not possess the strength within himself, physically or spiritually, to be able to rise to the occasion. There are other writers in the Bible that acknowledge that same principle. In the book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 12 and verse 9, Paul said, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me." He goes on into verse 10 and he says, "This is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." The psalmist said in the book of 23 in verse 6, he said, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." All these individuals had one thing in common. They understood that the journey to strength began through admitting they were weak. Until they were willing to admit that they were weak and that they were not sufficient to rise to the occasion of the challenge that God had given them, that they were not going to experience victory, but they would experience defeat, because they would be self-reliant upon their own strength, whether it be physical or spiritual or even emotional. They would experience defeat if they did not acknowledge that they needed the strength of God to empower them for the challenge that he had called them to meet. We find that Gideon goes on and he also asks God for a sign. And in verse 17 he said, "Now if I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you that is talking to me." Have you ever really wondered if it's God that's calling you to do something, or maybe it's Satan that is leading you to do something only to set you up for defeat? The one thing we know is this, that if we acknowledge that we are weak and that we need God's help in the challenge that has been presented to us, no matter what it may be, that may be a good indicator that it is God that's leading you to do it and not Satan. Because what Satan will do is he will get you to be self-reliant upon yourself and be separated from the strength that God has to offer to you, because he wants to lead you in an entrapment and ultimately lead you to defeat. Gideon asked for a sign, and God was going to give him an answer to that sign. And that's what we'll look at the next time that we come back. But remember this, the pathway to strength begins with acknowledging your weakness and your dependency upon God to give you the strength that you need.